She'd written the truth in her letters, that she was plain, unremarkable, forgettable. She'd crossed 2,000 miles believing no man would truly want her, only to discover that some men don't see with their eyes alone. In the fall of 1878, when Lydia Moore stepped off that stagecoach in Idaho Territory, she had no idea that a quiet cowboy named Caleb Turner was about to shatter every lie she'd ever told herself. This is a story about being seen, truly seen, for the first time. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Morrison's General Store, and Lydia Moore pressed her gloved hand against the worn leather seat to steady herself. Through the dust-clouded window, she could see the rough outline of Silver Creek, a collection of weathered buildings huddled together like strangers seeking warmth. The Idaho Territory stretched beyond the town in endless waves of sagebrush and distant mountains, beautiful and utterly indifferent. Her stomach twisted. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times during the journey west. In her mind, it had always been cleaner somehow, more dignified. She'd pictured herself stepping down gracefully, her traveling dress somehow unmarred by 2 weeks of dust and sweat. She'd imagined feeling brave. Instead, she felt small. "Silver Creek, miss," the driver called down, his voice hoarse from days of shouting over rattling wheels and wind. "End of the line." Lydia gathered her carpet bag and the small trunk that held everything she owned. Her fingers trembled as she fastened the clasp on her bag. Through the window, she could see people moving along the wooden boardwalk. Men mostly, their faces weathered by sun and wind. A few women in simple dresses. Everyone looked purposeful, like they belonged exactly where they were. She did not feel like she belonged. The door opened and the driver offered his hand. Lydia took it, stepping down into the autumn afternoon. The air smelled of wood smoke and horses, dust and something green she couldn't name. The wind tugged at her bonnet. "You being met, miss?" the driver asked, setting her trunk beside her on the boardwalk. Yes, I believe so." The driver tipped his hat and climbed back up to his seat. Within moments, the stagecoach was rolling away, leaving Lydia standing alone with her belongings and the weight of every choice that had brought her here. She'd answered an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper 6 months ago. "Rancher in Idaho Territory seeks honest woman of good character for marriage. Must be willing to work hard and build a life on the frontier. No beauty required, only strength of spirit." That last line had caught her. No beauty required. It felt like permission. Lydia had never been beautiful. She knew this the way she knew the sky was blue. A simple fact, established early and confirmed often. Her face was too round, her features too plain. Her figure was sturdy rather than graceful. In Philadelphia, men's eyes had slid past her in parlors and at church socials, always landing on someone else, someone prettier, someone worth noticing. So when she'd written her first letter to Caleb Turner, she'd been honest, painfully honest. She'd described herself as plain and unremarkable, a woman of simple education who could read and write and manage a household but would never turn heads or inspire poetry. She'd made herself smaller on the page than she already felt in life, hoping that lowered expectations might spare them both disappointment. His response had surprised her. "Miss Moore," he'd written in careful, measured script, "I'm not looking for poetry or turned heads. I'm looking for a partner. Someone who understands that life out here is hard but can be good with the right person beside you. Your honesty tells me more about your character than any flattery could. If you're willing to take a chance on a ranch in rough country and a man who's better with cattle than words, I'd be honored to have you." They'd exchanged letters through the summer. His were short but sincere, telling her about the ranch he'd built over 5 years of backbreaking work, the small herd he was building, the cabin that needed a woman's touch. He wrote about loneliness without shame, about wanting children someday, about believing that good marriages were built on respect and shared purpose rather than romance. Lydia had found herself trusting those letters, trusting him. And now she was here, 2,000 miles from everything familiar, waiting to meet a man whose face she'd never seen. "Miss Moore?" The voice came from behind her, low and careful. Lydia turned. He stood at the edge of the boardwalk, hat in his hands, tall and lean, with shoulders broadened by work and a face weathered by wind and sun. His hair was dark, curling slightly at his collar. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of the sky before a storm, and they were looking directly at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Mr. Turner?" she managed. "Caleb," he said, stepping closer. "Just Caleb." He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too rough, his jaw too strong, his hands too marked by labor. But there was something solid about him, something steady. He looked like a man who kept his word. "Lydia," she said quietly, "though I suppose you knew that." "I did." He turned his hat in his hands, and she realized he was nervous. Somehow that made her feel better. "Was the journey difficult?" "Long," she said, "but I'm here." "You are." He looked at her for a long moment, and Lydia felt heat rising in her cheeks. She wanted to look away, to escape that steady gaze, but something held her there. "I'm glad." She didn't know what to say to that. Caleb seemed to sense her uncertainty. He moved to pick up her trunk, lifting it easily despite its weight. "The wagon's just there. It's about an hour to the ranch. We can talk on the way. Get to know each other some before—" He trailed off, color touching his weathered cheeks. "Before we're married," Lydia finished softly. "Yes, ma'am." They walked to the wagon in silence. It was sturdy and practical, the bed lined with straw and covered with canvas. Caleb secured her trunk, then offered his hand to help her up to the seat. His palm was calloused and warm through her glove. As he climbed up beside her and gathered the reins, Lydia studied him from the corner of her eye. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own body, no wasted motion. When he clicked his tongue and the horses started forward, his hands were gentle on the leather. They left Silver Creek behind, the road narrowing to two ruts cutting through the sagebrush. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already touched with early snow. The land rolled and dipped, vast and open in a way that made Lydia's chest feel tight. "It's beautiful," she said, because the silence was becoming uncomfortable. "It can be hard too," Caleb said. "Winters are brutal, summers are long and dry. The work never stops." "You wrote about that." "I did." He glanced at her. "Wanted you to know what you were getting into. Didn't seem right to paint it prettier than it is." "I appreciated that." Lydia folded her hands in her lap. "I tried to do the same. In my letters." Something shifted in his expression. "You were honest. Perhaps too honest." "No such thing." He was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "You described yourself as plain." Lydia's throat tightened. "I am." "You're wrong." The words were so simple, so direct that they hit her like a physical blow. She turned to stare at him, certain she'd misheard. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, but his jaw was set. "I don't know what mirrors you've been looking in, Lydia, or what folks back east told you, but you're wrong." "Mr. Turner." "Caleb." "Caleb, I'm not fishing for compliments. I know what I am." "Do you?" Now he did look at her, and the intensity in those gray-blue eyes made her breath catch. "Bam!" "Because I've been looking at you since you stepped off that stage. And I don't see plain. I see strong. I see honest. I see a woman brave enough to cross half a country to build something new." He paused. "I see beautiful." Lydia couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. She wanted to argue, to explain all the ways he was mistaken, but the words wouldn't come. "You don't have to believe me," Caleb said, turning back to the road. "Not yet. But I'm going to keep saying it until you do." They rode in silence after that, but it was different now, charged somehow. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs, and she couldn't stop stealing glances at the man beside her. He thought she was beautiful. The idea was so foreign, so completely outside her experience, that she didn't know what to do with it. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a long rise. A cabin stood in a small valley, protected from the worst winds by a line of cottonwood trees along a creek. There was a barn, a corral, a chicken coop. Everything was simple but well-maintained, built by careful hands. "It's not much," Caleb said as they approached, "but it's solid. The cabin's got 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for living. There's a good stove and the roof doesn't leak. I added a window this summer, thought you might like the light." "You built this yourself?" "Most of it. Had help with the barn raising, but the cabin's my work." Lydia looked at the neat logs. the careful chinking, the stone chimney rising straight and true. It's wonderful. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the cabin and climbed down, then came around to help her. His hand spanned her waist as he lifted her down, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "Welcome home, Lydia." Home. The words settled around her like a blanket. Caleb showed her inside, carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing. The cabin was simple but clean, the floors swept, the stove blacked and gleaming. There was a table with 2 chairs, a dresser, a bed in the other room covered with a quilt in a wedding ring pattern. Everything spoke of care, of a man who'd prepared for her arrival. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," Caleb said, setting her trunk by the dresser. "Give you privacy to settle in. We can talk tomorrow about the wedding, about what you want." Lydia turned to face him. He stood by the door, hat in his hands again, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. She thought about his letters, about the honesty he'd shown, the respect, about the way he'd looked at her and seen something she'd never seen in herself. She thought about spending another night alone, carrying the weight of her own doubts. "What if I don't want to wait?" she heard herself say. Caleb went very still. "Lydia, you wrote that you wanted a partner, someone to build a life with." She clasped her hands together to stop them trembling. "I didn't come here to be courted, Caleb. I came here to be married, to start building that life." "Are you certain?" His voice was rough. "You've only just arrived. You barely know me." "I know you built this cabin for us. I know you were honest in your letters when you could have lied. I know you looked at me and saw something I've never seen." She took a breath. "I know I'm tired of being afraid." The silence stretched between them, taut as wire. "There's a minister in town," Caleb said finally. "Reverend Michaels. He'd marry us if we asked." "Tomorrow?" "If you want." Lydia nodded, her heart racing. "I want!" Something shifted in Caleb's expression, relief and wonder, and something deeper that made heat pool in her stomach. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her hands in his. His palms were warm and calloused, solid and real. "I'll be a good husband to you, Lydia. I swear it." "I believe you." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the gesture so gentle it made her eyes sting. "You should rest. It's been a long day. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." After he left, Lydia stood in the center of the cabin and tried to understand what had just happened. She'd agreed to marry a man she'd met hours ago. She'd spoken her desires aloud instead of swallowing them. She'd chosen courage over caution. She unpacked her few belongings with shaking hands, hanging her dresses on pegs, arranging her brush and mirror on the dresser. When she caught sight of her reflection, she paused. The same round face looked back at her, the same plain features, but something in her eyes was different, a spark that hadn't been there before. "I see beautiful," Caleb had said. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn to see it too. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Lydia woke before sunrise, dressed carefully in her best dress, a simple blue wool that brought out her eyes. She braided her hair and pinned it carefully, then stood before the small mirror and tried to see what Caleb saw. She still looked ordinary to herself, but perhaps that was all right. Caleb knocked softly before entering. He'd cleaned up, his hair still damp, wearing a clean shirt and vest. He held his hat and looked nervous in a way that made her smile. "You look lovely," he said. "Thank you." They rode to town in the wagon, side by side. The morning air was crisp, smelling of sage and earth. Neither spoke much, but the silence felt comfortable now, like they were both gathering themselves for what came next. Reverend Michaels met them at the small church at the edge of town. He was an older man with kind eyes who asked no questions about their brief acquaintance, only whether they understood the commitment they were making. "I do," Lydia said. "I do," Caleb echoed. There were no flowers, no music, no guests, just 2 people standing before a minister in an empty church, speaking words that would bind them together. When Caleb slipped a simple gold band on her finger, his hand was steady. When he kissed her, soft and brief, Lydia felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening. They were married. The ride back to the ranch passed in a blur. Lydia kept looking at the ring on her finger, the proof that she was someone's wife now, that someone had chosen her. When they reached the cabin, Caleb helped her down from the wagon and didn't immediately let go. His hands rested on her waist, and he looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes. Are you?" "Yes." He smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger. "More than all right." Inside, Lydia moved to the stove. "I should make dinner." Later, Caleb caught her hand, gently turning her to face him. I need to tell you something first." She waited, her heart racing. "I know this all happened fast," he said slowly. "I know you might have doubts, but I meant what I said yesterday. You're beautiful, Lydia, and not just to look at, though you are, no matter what you believe. You're beautiful in the way you were brave enough to come here, in the way you speak honestly, in the way you chose trust over fear." Lydia's eyes burned. "I don't understand why you see me this way." "Because it's the truth." He cupped her face in his rough palm. "I'm not asking you to believe it overnight, but I'm going to show you, every day, until you see yourself the way I see you." She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "I want to believe you." That's enough for now. When he kissed her this time, it was different, deeper, full of promise and patience. Lydia kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and tentative trust into it. They moved to the bedroom together, and what happened there was tender and careful, two strangers learning each other with gentle hands and whispered words. Caleb was patient when she was nervous, careful when she was uncertain. He told her she was beautiful until she almost believed it. And afterward, lying in his arms with the quilt pulled over them and the afternoon light slanting through the window, Lydia felt something she'd never felt before. Seen, chosen, wanted. Perhaps this was what home felt like. The days that followed settled into rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn to tend the cattle and horses. Lydia learned the routines of the ranch, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, managing the root cellar, cooking meals that would sustain a working man. The work was constant and demanding, so different from her life in Philadelphia that some days she barely recognized herself. But she was learning the land, learning the work, learning her husband. Caleb was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He brought her wildflowers he found while riding the range. He built her a better clothesline without being asked. When she struggled to carry water from the creek, he rigged up a clever system of buckets and rope that made it easier. He noticed things, when she was tired, when something pleased her, when she needed space or company, and he kept his promise. Every day, in small ways and large, he showed her that he meant what he'd said. "You're getting better with the bread," he said one evening, savoring a slice with butter. "It's not as good as it should be." "It's perfect." "Caleb, perfect," he repeated firmly. "Because you made it." She learned to accept his compliments, even when they felt foreign. Learned to meet his eyes when he told her she looked pretty in the morning light. Learned to believe that his desire for her wasn't duty, but genuine want. And slowly, carefully, she began to want him back. At night, they would lie together in the darkness and talk about their childhoods, his on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, hers in a crowded boarding house in Philadelphia, about the dreams that had brought them west, about the life they were building together. "I never thought I'd have this," Lydia confessed one night, her head on his chest. "A home. A husband who—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Who loves you?" Caleb supplied quietly. Her breath caught. They hadn't spoken that word yet. "Is that what this is?" she whispered. "Yes." His arms tightened around her. "I didn't expect it to happen so fast, but yes, Lydia. I love you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "How? You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you're kind to the animals. I know you hum when you're cooking. I know you watch the sunset every evening like it's a gift. I know you're stronger than you think you are." He brushed the tears from her face. "I know I want to spend every day showing you how extraordinary you are." "I love you too," she breathed, the words escaping before she could think better of them. But they felt right. True. His kiss tasted like promise. Winter came hard and fast. The first snow fell in late October, blanketing the ranch in white silence. The work changed, feeding cattle through deep drifts, breaking ice on the water trough, keeping the cabin warm through nights when the temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows. It was brutal, exhausting, relentless. But they faced it together. Lydia learned to read the weather, to anticipate storms before they hit. She learned to manage the stove so the fire never went out, to make meals stretch when supplies ran low, to mend and make do. She learned the strength in her own back and hands, the resilience she'd never known she possessed. And she learned that love wasn't just tender moments by firelight. It was Caleb trudging through a blizzard to check on cattle while she kept hot coffee waiting. It was holding each other for warmth on the coldest nights. It was steady presence through monotony and struggle. One particularly brutal January day when the wind howled like something alive and the temperature was too cold to even consider going outside, they stayed in bed late. Caleb held her close, his breath warm against her hair. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming here?" Lydia thought about Philadelphia, the cramped boarding house, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach, terrified and certain of her own inadequacy. "No," she said, "not for a moment. Even when it's this hard. Especially then." She turned to face him. "Because I'm not alone anymore." He kissed her softly. "You'll never be alone again. I promise." Spring arrived like a miracle. The snow melted, revealing the brown earth beneath. Green shoots appeared overnight. The creek swelled with runoff and the cattle grew restless, ready for open range. And Lydia realized she was pregnant. She told Caleb one evening after dinner, her hands clasped tight in her lap to stop them trembling. She watched his face carefully, afraid of disappointment, of burden. Instead, she saw wonder. "A baby?" he breathed. "Yes, I think around harvest time." He crossed the room and dropped to his knees before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Lydia, my beautiful Lydia." His voice broke. "You've given me everything." "We made this together," she said softly. "I know, but you'll carry this child. Bring it into the world. You're so strong, so—" He shook his head. "I don't have the words." She cupped his face in her hands. "You found the words when I needed them most, on that first day. You told me I was beautiful when I didn't believe it. Do you believe it now?" She looked into his eyes, this man who'd seen past every lie she'd told herself, who'd chosen her without hesitation, who loved her with steady constancy. "Yes," she said, "I'm starting to." His smile was brilliant. "Good, because it's the truth." The months that followed were full of preparation. Caleb built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there wasn't a single rough edge. Lydia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving in rhythm with her growing belly. They talked about names, about the future, about all the ways their lives were about to change. The work continued, harder now with the weight she carried. But Caleb was there, lifting what was too heavy, doing what was too strenuous, caring for her with the same steady devotion he'd shown from the beginning. "I can do it," she'd protest when he took over some task. "I know you can," he'd say, "but you don't have to, not alone." In late September, when the aspen leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp with autumn's approach, their daughter arrived. The labor was long and hard, attended by a midwife from town, and punctuated by Caleb's worried pacing outside the bedroom door. But when Lydia finally held that tiny, perfect girl in her arms, all the pain dissolved into wonder. Caleb knelt beside the bed, his rough hand gentle on their daughter's downy head. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "like her mother." "She's perfect," Lydia agreed. They named her Grace because that's what she was, unearned, undeserved blessing. The years turned like pages. Grace grew from infant to toddler to little girl, her laughter filling the cabin and surrounding land. A son followed 2 years later, Thomas, sturdy and serious even as a baby. Then another daughter, Sarah, with her father's gray-blue eyes. The ranch grew too. More cattle, better fences, a larger barn. Caleb hired hands during busy seasons. They added a room to the cabin, then another. What had started as a rough homestead became a thriving operation built on hard work and partnership. But more than the land or the stock or the buildings, what grew was the family itself. Lydia would watch Caleb with their children, patient and kind, teaching them to ride and rope, to read and write, to understand the value of honest work and honest words. She'd watch him across the dinner table, his face weathered by sun and time, and feel her heart swell with love so fierce it sometimes stole her breath. And he still told her she was beautiful. On ordinary mornings when she was covered in flour from baking, on hard evenings when exhaustion lined her face, on winter nights when gray streaked her hair and time had softened her body. He never stopped seeing her the way he'd seen her that first day, worthy, wanted, loved. "You're still looking at me like that," she said one evening, 20 years after they'd married. The children were grown now, starting their own lives. The cabin was quiet in a way it hadn't been for decades. "Like what?" Caleb asked, though his smile said he knew. "Like I'm something special." "You are." He pulled her into his arms and she went willingly, fitting against him the way she had for 2 decades. "You're everything." "I'm old," she protested without heat. "You're beautiful," he corrected. "Even more now than when I first saw you, because now I know everything you are, every sacrifice you've made, every hardship you've endured, every moment of grace you've shown." He kissed her forehead. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Lydia closed her eyes and let herself believe it. After all these years, after all his patient insistence, she finally, fully believed it. Not because mirrors had changed or age had been kind, but because Caleb had taught her a different way of seeing, one that measured beauty in strength and kindness, in courage and constancy, in all the ways a person shows up for the life they've chosen and the people they love. She'd crossed 2,000 miles believing she was ordinary, forgettable, plain. She'd found a man who saw her truly and loved exactly what he saw. And in learning to see herself through his eyes, she'd discovered something profound, that being seen, really, truly seen, was its own kind of miracle. That love wasn't about perfection, but about someone choosing you, flaws and all, and declaring you enough, more than enough, beautiful. The morning Grace turned 16, Lydia stood at the stove frying eggs and bacon while watching her daughter through the kitchen window. Grace was in the corral working with a young mare, her movements confident and sure. She had Caleb's patience with horses and Lydia's quiet determination, a combination that made her fearless in ways Lydia had never been at that age. Thomas came thundering down the stairs, 12 years old and perpetually hungry. "Is breakfast ready?" "Nearly. Go wash up and wake your sister." "Sarah's already up. She's out bothering Pa in the barn." Lydia smiled. Their youngest was 8 now, shadowing Caleb whenever he'd allow it. She had none of Grace's reserve or Thomas's boisterous energy. Sarah was pure sunshine, chattering constantly and finding joy in everything. Caleb came in as she was setting the table, Sarah trailing behind him with a basket of eggs. He pressed a kiss to Lydia's temple in passing, a gesture so familiar after 20 years that she barely registered it. Except she did. She always did. "Grace is doing well with that mare," he said, settling into his chair. "She'll have her saddle broke by month's end." "She's got your gift," Lydia said, placing a platter of eggs on the table. "She's got your determination. I just taught her the mechanics." Grace came in then, cheeks flushed from the cold morning air. She'd grown tall with Lydia's sturdy build and Caleb's striking eyes. Not beautiful by conventional standards, but handsome in a way that turned heads. Strong, capable. Watching her, Lydia sometimes saw herself at that age, except Grace carried none of the self-doubt that had plagued Lydia. Grace knew her worth. Caleb had made sure of that, raising his daughter to believe she was extraordinary, just as he'd taught Lydia the same lesson. They ate breakfast together, the conversation flowing easily. Thomas talked about a book he was reading. Sarah chattered about the new kittens in the barn. Grace mentioned that the Hendersons' oldest son, James, had asked if he could come courting. Caleb's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "James Henderson?" "He's nice enough," Grace said, not quite meeting her father's eyes. "Polite." "He's 17, Caleb said carefully, "and I'm 16. Lydia hid her smile behind her coffee cup. She caught Caleb's eye and saw the panic there, his little girl, being courted. She reached under the table and squeezed his knee gently. "What did you tell him?" Lydia asked. that he'd have to ask Pa's permission. Grace looked up then, and there was something in her eyes that reminded Lydia so much of herself at that age. Uncertainty, hope. I said I'd like to get to know him better, but that I wouldn't go anywhere without you both knowing. That was wise, Caleb said, his voice tight. After breakfast, while the children scattered to their various tasks, Caleb pulled Lydia aside. She's too young. She's the age I was when I crossed the country to marry you. That's different. How? Lydia challenged gently. Caleb ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he made when frustrated. I don't know. It just is. Lydia cupped his face, feeling the roughness of his morning stubble. She's careful. We raised her to be. And you'll terrify any boy who doesn't treat her with respect. Damn right I will. Caleb Turner, language. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. I'm not ready for this. For her to grow up and leave. Neither am I, Lydia admitted softly. But we don't get to stop time. We just have to trust that we've given her what she needs. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. After 20 years, she still fit perfectly against his chest. When did you get so wise? I learned from you. He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. I'm pretty sure it's the other way around. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. They pulled apart as a rider approached, one of the hands from the neighboring ranch, young Matthew Collins. He looked agitated. Mr. Turner, Mrs. Turner, he called, pulling his horse up short. Sorry to bother you so early, but there's trouble. The Broken Creek Ranch. Fire broke out last night. Destroyed the barn and most of their winter stores. Caleb's expression shifted immediately to concern. The Broken Creek Ranch belonged to William and Martha Davis, an older couple who'd been struggling since their sons moved east. Anyone hurt? No, sir, but they lost near everything. Mr. Davis is asking if folks can spare what they can. Caleb looked at Lydia. She nodded without hesitation. Tell them we'll bring supplies this afternoon, Caleb said. Food, blankets, whatever they need. After Matthew rode off, Lydia began mentally cataloging what they could spare. It would make their own winter stores tighter, but the Davises had helped them when Grace was born, when Lydia had been too weak to manage the household. You didn't forget that kind of kindness. Grace appeared in the doorway. I heard. I'll help load the wagon. You've got your own work. The mare can wait, Pa. This is more important. Lydia caught Caleb's eye and saw the pride there. Their daughter understood what mattered. They spent the morning gathering supplies, sacks of flour and beans, preserved vegetables from the root cellar, blankets Lydia had woven herself. Thomas contributed the venison he'd smoked. Even Sarah insisted on adding the jam she'd helped Lydia make. The ride to the Broken Creek Ranch took 2 hours. When they arrived, the devastation was worse than Lydia had imagined. The barn was nothing but charred timber and ash. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air. Martha Davis met them at the door of the cabin, her face streaked with soot and tears. Lydia, Caleb, you didn't have to— Yes, we did, Lydia said firmly, embracing the older woman. Where's William? Out salvaging what he can, but there's not much. Martha's voice broke. They unloaded the supplies while Martha wept quietly. Other neighbors arrived throughout the afternoon, the Hendersons with lumber, the Mitchells with hay, the Petersons with livestock feed. This was how it worked out here. When one family fell, the others lifted them up. William Davis appeared as they were finishing, his face haggard. He shook Caleb's hand wordlessly, then turned to survey the supplies. I don't know how to thank you all, he said hoarsely. You'd do the same, Caleb replied simply. On the ride home, Grace was quiet. Lydia watched her daughter stare out at the darkening landscape, her young face thoughtful. What are you thinking about? Lydia asked. How fast everything can change, Grace said softly. They built that barn with their own hands, their whole winter's work gone in one night. That's why we help each other, Caleb said, because we all know it could be us tomorrow. It's not fair, though, Grace said. They're good people. They work hard. Life isn't about fair, Lydia said gently. It's about what you do when unfair things happen, how you help, how you endure. Grace nodded slowly, absorbing this. Lydia saw her daughter growing up in real time, childhood certainties giving way to harder truths. That night, after the children were asleep, Lydia and Caleb sat by the fire. She was mending one of Thomas's shirts. The boy tore through clothes like they were paper, while Caleb oiled harnesses that needed repair. Grace was shaken today, Caleb said quietly. She's old enough to understand how fragile things are now. I remember that age, when you realize your parents can't protect you from everything. Oh, Lydia set down her mending. We've protected them from a lot. Maybe too much. What do you mean? She chose her words carefully. They've never known real hardship, real loss. They've grown up secure and loved. That's good. I wouldn't change it. But someday they'll face things we can't shield them from. And I wonder if we've prepared them enough. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. We've taught them to work hard, to be kind, to help their neighbors. What else can we do? I don't know, Lydia admitted. I just worry. You always worry. He set aside the harness and pulled her close. They're strong kids. They'll be all right. She wanted to believe him, but she was a mother now, and mothers worried. It was as natural as breathing. Winter settled in hard that year. The snow came early and deep, and the cold was relentless. The Davises moved into their small cabin while neighbors helped rebuild the barn, working whenever the weather allowed. Caleb spent days helping with the construction, coming home exhausted and half frozen. Lydia kept the home fires burning, literally and figuratively. She cooked enormous meals to fuel the men working on the barn. She kept the children's lessons going even when they'd rather play in the snow. She managed the ranch operations Caleb couldn't attend to, rising before dawn to break ice on the water troughs and feed the stock. Some days the work felt endless. Some days she fell into bed so exhausted she couldn't speak. But she never complained. This was the life they'd built, the community they'd chosen. And when Martha Davis hugged her at the barn raising, tears streaming down weathered cheeks, Lydia knew it mattered. Christmas came quiet and simple that year. Money was tight for everyone after the supplies they'd given the Davises, but they made do. Lydia sewed new dresses for the girls from fabric she'd been saving. Caleb carved wooden animals for Sarah and a beautiful jewelry box for Grace. Thomas received a new hunting knife he'd been wanting. On Christmas morning, they sat around the tree Caleb had cut from their own land and sang carols while snow fell softly outside. Grace played the small pump organ they'd bought 2 years prior, her fingers finding the notes with increasing confidence. Sarah's voice soared above them all, pure and sweet. Lydia looked around at her family, Caleb's arm around her shoulders, their children gathered close, and felt something so powerful it made her chest ache. Gratitude, joy, the bone-deep satisfaction of a life well lived. What are you thinking? Caleb murmured against her hair. That I have everything I never knew I wanted. His arm tightened. Me too. The new year brought new challenges. In February, influenza swept through the territory. It hit the children first. Sarah developed a fever that spiked so high she became delirious. Lydia sat up for 3 nights straight, bathing her youngest daughter with cool cloths and forcing liquid down her throat while terror clawed at her chest. Caleb hovered, helpless and frantic. Should I ride for the doctor? The snow's too deep. We'd never make it. Lydia kept her voice steady even though her hands shook. We just have to wait it out. On the 4th day, Sarah's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes and asked for water in a voice so weak it was barely a whisper. Lydia cried with relief while Caleb held them both. But the illness wasn't finished. Thomas fell sick next, then Grace. Lydia nursed them through it, running on coffee and determination. Caleb took over all the ranch work, pushing himself to exhaustion to spare her one more burden. And then Caleb got sick. Lydia had never been so frightened. Caleb was strong, the strongest person she knew, but the fever laid him low. For 5 days he burned with it, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in fever dreams. She forced water down his throat, bathed him with cool cloths, and prayed to a god she'd stopped addressing formally years ago. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered fiercely during the worst of it, when his breathing turned shallow and labored. You promised you'd never leave me alone." His eyes flickered open, glassy with fever. "Lydia, I'm here. I'm right here." "So beautiful," he mumbled. "My beautiful wife." Even delirious with fever, he saw her that way. The realization broke something open in her chest. "You have to fight," she said, tears streaming down her face. Our children need you. I need you. Please, Caleb, please fight. The fever broke on the 6th day. Caleb woke weak and disoriented, but lucid. When he saw Lydia slumped in the chair beside the bed, dark circles under her eyes and exhaustion written in every line of her body, he reached for her hand. How long? He rasped. 6 days. And the children? Better, recovering. She gripped his hand so hard her knuckles went white. You scared me. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just don't do it again. He managed a weak smile. I'll try. Recovery was slow. It took weeks before Caleb could work a full day, before his strength fully returned. The children bounced back faster, as children did, but Lydia noticed they stayed closer to home than usual. Even Grace, usually so independent, seemed reluctant to let her parents out of sight. The illness had shaken them all, reminded them how quickly everything could change. Spring arrived like a benediction. The snow melted, the creek swelled, and green shoots pushed through the brown earth. Life returned to the land and to their family. Grace turned 17 that summer, and James Henderson became a regular visitor. Lydia watched her daughter navigate courtship with the same careful consideration she brought to everything. James was a good young man, respectful, hard-working, clearly smitten. But Grace took her time, testing the depth of his character. She's being smart, Lydia told Caleb one evening as they watched James and Grace walk by the creek, carefully chaperoned by Thomas, who was doing a terrible job of pretending not to spy on them. She's too young, Caleb grumbled. She's exactly the age I was. And you were too young too. Lydia laughed and took his hand. It worked out though, didn't it? He pulled her close, kissing her soundly. It did, but that doesn't mean I have to like watching my daughter grow up. No, Lydia agreed, but we have to let her. That fall, the Davises invited everyone who'd helped them to a barn dance in their new barn. The whole community turned out, dressed in their finest. Someone had a fiddle, someone else a guitar. Tables groaned under the weight of food everyone had contributed. Lydia watched Grace dance with James, saw the careful way he held her, the respect in his eyes. She saw Thomas dancing with the Mitchell's daughter, clumsy and earnest. She saw Sarah spinning with wild abandon, her laughter infectious. And then Caleb was there, offering his hand. Dance with me? I'm not very good, she protested, though she let him pull her onto the floor. Neither am I. We'll be terrible together. They were. Caleb had 2 left feet, and Lydia kept losing the rhythm. But they were laughing, and his arms were around her, and nothing else mattered. I love you, he said against her hair. Have I told you that today? Only 3 times. Then I'm behind schedule. She tilted her head back to look at him. His face was weathered now, lined by sun and age and worry. Gray threaded through his dark hair, but his eyes were the same, that storm cloud gray blue that had seen her truly from the very first moment. I love you too, she said. Even when you can't dance. Especially when I can't dance, he corrected. As the evening wore on and the music slowed, Lydia found herself standing outside the barn with Martha Davis. The older woman watched the dancers through the open doors, a soft smile on her face. You've built something good, Martha said quietly. You and Caleb. We've been lucky. It's not luck. Martha turned to look at her. It's work. It's choosing each other every day. It's holding on when things get hard. She paused. William and I, we had some rough years. Times I thought about leaving, times he probably did too. But we chose to stay, to keep choosing each other. I never knew that, Lydia said softly. Most people don't. Everyone thinks good marriages just happen, like magic. But it's not magic. It's commitment. It's forgiveness. It's seeing the best in each other even when you're both at your worst. Lydia thought about the years she and Caleb had built together, the struggles and triumphs, the ordinary days and extraordinary moments, the way he still looked at her like she hung the moon, the way she still felt her heart skip when he smiled. Thank you, she said, for saying that. Martha squeezed her hand. You remind me of myself at your age, so certain you weren't enough. It took me years to believe William when he said I was beautiful, years to see myself the way he saw me. How did you finally believe it?
I watched him choose me, day after day, year after year. Eventually, I realized that if a man that good, that honest, saw something worth loving in me, maybe I should trust his judgment. Lydia felt tears sting her eyes. That's exactly how it was for me. I know, dear. I watched you two grow into yourselves, into each other. Martha smiled. You're teaching your daughter the same lesson. I see it in how she carries herself, how she expects to be treated with respect. That's your legacy, Lydia. Not just the ranch or the children, but teaching them to know their own worth. That night, lying in bed with Caleb's arm around her and the sound of their children's breathing in nearby rooms, Lydia thought about legacies, about all the ways a life rippled outward, touching others. She'd come west believing she was ordinary, forgettable, plain. But she'd built an extraordinary life. She'd raised children who knew they were loved. She'd stood beside a good man through decades of joy and hardship. She'd learned to see herself as beautiful, not because mirrors had changed, but because she'd finally believed the man who'd never stopped telling her the truth. What are you thinking about? Caleb murmured sleepily. Everything, she said. All of it. He pulled her closer. Good thoughts? The best? Good. He pressed a kiss to her hair. Sleep now. Tomorrow's another day. But Lydia lay awake a while longer, listening to the familiar sounds of her home, the creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, the steady rhythm of her husband's breathing. This was her life, hard-won and precious, built on a foundation of being truly seen by someone who'd never stopped looking at her with wonder. And it was beautiful. The morning Grace announced her engagement, Lydia was in the garden pulling weeds. She heard her daughter's voice calling from the house and straightened, pressing a hand to her lower back. At 42, her body reminded her daily of every year she'd spent working this land. Grace appeared at the garden gate, her face flushed and radiant. James Henderson stood behind her, looking nervous and proud in equal measure. "Mama," Grace said, her voice trembling with excitement. "James asked me to marry him. I said yes." Lydia brushed the dirt from her hands and studied the young couple before her. Grace was 18 now, a woman grown despite how recently she'd been a child. James was 20, solid and steady like his father. They'd been courting for over a year, always proper, always respectful. "Did you ask her father?" Lydia directed the question at James. "Yes, ma'am. This morning, he gave his blessing." James swallowed hard. "Said I'd better treat her right, or he'd know the reason why." That sounded like Caleb. Lydia felt a smile tug at her lips despite the tightness in her chest. Her daughter, getting married, leaving. "Then I'm happy for you both," she said, opening her arms to Grace. Her daughter flew into her embrace, and Lydia held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. When had Grace grown taller than her? When had her little girl become a woman ready for her own life? "I'm scared, Mama," Grace whispered against her shoulder. "I know, sweetheart. I was terrified when I married your father. But you'd never even met him. James and I have been courting for over a year." Lydia pulled back to look at her daughter's face. "It's still a leap of faith. Marriage always is. But if you love him, and he loves you, that's enough to start with." "He does love me," Grace said softly. "He tells me all the time. And he sees me, really sees me, the way Pa sees you." Lydia's throat tightened. That was all any mother could hope for, that her daughter would find someone who saw her worth, who chose her deliberately and completely. "Then you'll be just fine," she said. They planned the wedding for early summer, before the hardest ranch work began. The whole community would attend. That's how it worked out here. Weddings were rare celebrations, excuses for everyone to gather and remember that life held joy alongside its hardships. Lydia threw herself into preparations, grateful for the distraction from her own emotions. She sewed Grace's wedding dress with hands that had sewn 1,000 garments over the years, each stitch an act of love. The dress was simple but beautiful, white cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. One evening while she worked, Grace sat beside her, hemming dish towels for her new home. "Tell me about your wedding," Grace said. "You've never talked about it much." Lydia threaded her needle carefully. "There's not much to tell. Your father and I were married by Reverend Michaels in town. No guests, no celebration,
Just the two of us making promises we barely understood yet. Were you happy? I was terrified, Lydia admitted. I'd known your father less than a day. I had no idea if I'd made the right choice. But you had, Grace said softly. Yes, but I didn't know that yet. I had to learn it day by day, year by year. Lydia paused in her sewing. Your father saw something in me I'd never seen in myself. It took me a long time to believe him, to understand that I was worth loving. Grace was quiet for a moment. James says I'm beautiful, all the time. Sometimes I think he's just being kind. Lydia set down her needle and took her daughter's hands. Listen to me. If James sees beauty in you, believe him. Don't waste years doubting like I did. Your father spent 2 decades convincing me of my worth, learned faster than I did. But what if I'm not? You are, Lydia interrupted firmly. You're strong and capable and kind. You have your father's integrity and your own fierce heart. Any man would be lucky to have you. James knows that. Trust him when he tells you. Tears shimmered in Grace's eyes. I'm going to miss you, Mama. I'm going to miss you too, sweetheart. More than I can say. They held each other while the evening light faded through the windows, mother and daughter marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Caleb took the engagement harder than Lydia expected. He grew quiet and withdrawn, throwing himself into ranch work with an intensity that worried her. One evening, she found him in the barn long after dark, mending tack that didn't need mending. Caleb. He looked up, his face drawn in the lamplight. Just finishing up. You've been finishing up for 3 hours. She sat down on a hay bale. Talk to me. He set down the leather he'd been working. I keep thinking about her as a baby, this tiny thing I could hold in one hand. And now she's getting married, starting her own life. It happened too fast. It did, Lydia agreed softly. What if he doesn't treat her right? What if he doesn't see how extraordinary she is? He does. You can see it in how he looks at her, the same way you look at me. Caleb's eyes met hers, and she saw the fear there. The same fear she felt but had learned to hide. I'm not ready to let her go, he said hoarsely. Neither am I. But we don't get a choice in this. We raised her to be strong enough to build her own life. Now we have to trust that we did it right. He crossed to her and sank down on the hay bale, pulling her against his side. They sat in silence for a long while, drawing comfort from each other's presence, the way they had for more than 20 years. When did we get old? Caleb finally asked. Lydia laughed despite herself. We're not old, we're just older. My back hurts all the time. Gray in my hair. Our daughter's getting married. And we've built a good life, raised good children, survived everything this land threw at us. She turned to look at him. I'd say we've done all right. He cupped her face in his rough palm, studying her in the lamplight. You're still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Even with the gray in my hair? Especially with it. Every gray hair is a year we've lived together. I earned every one of them. She kissed him then, soft and sweet, tasting of familiarity and forever. The wedding day arrived bright and clear. The cabin had been transformed, wildflowers everywhere, tables set up outside for the celebration afterward. Neighbors began arriving at mid-morning, dressed in their finest, bringing food and well wishes. Lydia helped Grace into her wedding dress, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons. Her daughter looked radiant, her eyes bright with joy and nerves. You're shaking, Mama. I know. Lydia smoothed the dress over Grace's shoulders. I can't seem to stop. Are you all right? I'm perfect. Lydia met her daughter's eyes in the mirror. You're so beautiful, Grace. I hope you know that. I hope you really know it. I'm learning to, Grace said softly. You and Pa taught me that I'm worth loving, that I don't have to be perfect to be chosen. Lydia's vision blurred with tears. That's all we ever wanted for you. Outside, Reverend Michaels, older now, his hair white as snow, stood ready. The same man who'd married Lydia and Caleb stood before Grace and James, speaking the same words he'd spoken more than 2 decades earlier. Lydia stood beside Caleb, holding his hand tightly. She could feel him trembling, saw the shine of tears in his eyes when James slipped the ring on Grace's finger. When the Reverend pronounced them married and James kissed his bride, Caleb made a sound like something breaking. She's happy, Lydia whispered to him. Look at her face. She's so happy. I know, he managed. I know. The celebration lasted into the evening. There was music and dancing, food and laughter. Lydia watched Grace dance with her new husband, saw the joy on her daughter's face, and felt her heart swell with bittersweet pride. Later, as the sun began to set, Grace found her parents standing together near the house. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for raising me, for loving me, for showing me what a good marriage looks like." Caleb pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Be happy, Grace. That's all we ask. Be happy and let yourself be loved." "I will, Pa. I promise." After Grace and James left for their own small cabin on the Henderson Ranch, the house felt too quiet. Thomas had gone to help a neighbor with spring planting and wouldn't be back for days. Sarah was asleep upstairs. Lydia and Caleb sat on the porch in the gathering darkness, listening to the last of the guests depart. "Strange how empty it feels already," Caleb said. "It'll take getting used to." Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder. "But we still have Thomas and Sarah. For now. They'll grow up too. Leave us too. That's what we raised them to do." He was quiet for a long moment. "What will we do when they're all gone? When it's just us again?" Lydia smiled in the darkness. "The same thing we've always done. Live, work, love each other. We started with just the two of us, remember? We'll manage." "I suppose we will." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "As long as I have you." "Always," she promised. "Always." The years continued their relentless march. Thomas, at 15, grew into a quiet young man who preferred books to people and had a gift for mathematics that none of them quite understood. Sarah bloomed into a vivacious 12-year-old with her father's eyes and her mother's determination. Grace visited often with James, and eventually with their first child, a daughter they named Lydia. When Lydia held her granddaughter for the first time, she understood why Grace had been so hard to let go. This tiny creature represented the future, the continuation of everything they'd built. "She's perfect," Lydia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She looks like you," Grace said softly. "Mama, she has your eyes." Caleb stood behind Lydia, peering down at his granddaughter with wonder. "Another beautiful girl in this family." "You're going to spoil her rotten," Lydia predicted. "Absolutely," he agreed without shame. But joy and sorrow walked hand in hand as they always had. That fall, William Davis took sick. The illness came on sudden and fierce, and despite Martha's desperate nursing, he died within a week. The funeral was held on a gray October day, the first snow already dusting the mountains. Lydia stood beside Martha at the graveside, holding the older woman's hand while the Reverend spoke words that felt inadequate to the loss. After everyone else had left, Martha stood staring at the fresh-turned earth, her face carved from grief. "I don't know how to be alone," she said quietly. "We were married 43 years. I don't know who I am without him." Lydia put her arm around Martha's shoulders. "You're still yourself, still the woman he loved. That doesn't change." "It feels like it does. Like half of me died with him." "I know." Lydia thought about Caleb, about how intertwined their lives had become. "But you taught me something important once. You told me that good marriages are built on choosing each other every day. He chose you for 43 years, Martha. That's part of you now. It lives in you." Martha turned to look at her, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Promise me something, Lydia. When your time comes, when Caleb's time comes, and it will, for all of us, promise me you'll remember that the love doesn't die. It changes, but it doesn't die." "I promise," Lydia said, though the words felt like stones in her throat. That winter was the hardest in memory. Snow fell relentlessly, piling so deep that some days they couldn't leave the cabin. The cold was bitter and unforgiving. They lost cattle to the weather despite their best efforts, and more than once Caleb came in half frozen from checking on the herd. Lydia would help him out of his ice-crusted coat, would make him sit by the fire while she heated coffee and soup. She'd rub feeling back into his frozen fingers, scolding him for staying out too long, even as her heart clenched with fear. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," she said one particularly brutal evening. "You're not 20 anymore. The cattle don't care how old I am." "I care. The children care." She cupped his face, feeling how cold his skin still was. "We need you, Caleb, more than we need the cattle." He caught her hands, pressing them to his chest. "I'm all right, Lydia. I promise." But she could see the toll the work was taking. His shoulders stooped more than they used to. He moved slower, more carefully. The hard years were catching up with all of them. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, and with it came Thomas's announcement that he'd been accepted to a teaching college in Wyoming. "Teaching," Caleb said, unable to hide his surprise. "Not ranching." Thomas shook his head, his expression both apologetic and determined. "I love this place, Pa. I do. But it's not my calling. I want to teach, to help other children learn and grow." Lydia saw Caleb struggling with disappointment. The ranch had always been meant to pass to Thomas eventually, but she also saw him swallow it down, replace it with acceptance. "Then you should go," Caleb said quietly.
"Follow your calling. That's what matters." "I'm sorry, Pa." "Don't be." Caleb gripped his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you. Your mother and I were both proud. You're going to do good work." After Thomas left, the house felt even emptier. Sarah tried to fill the silence with her chatter, but she was only one child where there had been three. One evening, Lydia found Caleb in the barn, again, this time actually working on a broken harness. She brought him coffee and sat beside him in comfortable silence. "The ranch will go to Grace and James," he said finally, "when we're gone. That feels right." "It does," Lydia agreed. "They love this land the way we do." "All those years ago, when I sent that advertisement to the Philadelphia paper, I never imagined this. Any of it." He set down his work and turned to her. "I just wanted a partner, someone to share the work with. And instead you got 3 children, a granddaughter, and a wife who still can't dance." He smiled. "I got everything I needed. Everything I didn't even know to want." "Me too," she said softly. "I came here thinking I was settling for whatever life would give me. I never dreamed I'd have this, that I'd be this happy. You believed me eventually when I told you that you were beautiful. It only took you 25 years of telling me." "Worth every word," he said, pulling her close. They sat together in the barn, watching dust motes dance in the last of the evening light. 2 people who'd built a life from nothing but hope and hard work and the decision to see the best in each other. Sarah announced her own plans the following year. At 15, she'd been corresponding with a missionary family in Oregon who needed a teacher for their small school. "I want to go," she said, her young face earnest. "I want to see more of the world than just Idaho. I want to help people the way Uncle Thomas is helping people with teaching." Lydia's heart broke and swelled simultaneously. "You're so young." "I'm the same age Grace was when she started courting James." "That's different." "How?" Sarah challenged, so much of Lydia's own spirit in her voice. Caleb spoke before Lydia could. "It's not different. She's right. If this is what she wants, we should support her." Lydia wanted to argue, to keep her baby close. But she looked at Sarah's determined face and saw herself at that age, ready to cross a continent for a chance at something new. How could she deny her daughter the same courage? "All right," she said quietly, "but you write to us. Every week. And if it doesn't work out, you come home. No shame in that." Sarah threw her arms around Lydia's neck. "Thank you, Mama. I promise I'll make you proud." "You already have, sweetheart." The house felt cavernous with all the children gone. Lydia found herself rattling around in rooms that had once been full of noise and laughter. Some days she'd forget and call out to Thomas to help with something, or expect to hear Sarah's chatter from upstairs. But the children wrote faithfully. Grace sent news of her growing family. 2 more grandchildren arrived in quick succession, both boys. Thomas wrote about his students and the satisfaction of watching young minds expand. Sarah's letters brimmed with enthusiasm for her work and the wild beauty of Oregon. Their lives were full. They were happy. That was what mattered. Lydia and Caleb settled into new rhythms. The work was harder now, with just the 2 of them and the occasional hired hand, but they managed. They'd been doing this together for so long that they moved in perfect synchrony, each anticipating the other's needs without words. On their 25th anniversary, Caleb surprised her with a trip to Silver Creek for dinner at the hotel restaurant. It was an extravagance they rarely allowed themselves, and Lydia wore her best dress, the one she'd made for Grace's wedding. Over roast beef and potatoes,
Caleb pulled out a small wrapped package. You didn't need to get me anything, Lydia protested. Open it. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain. When Lydia opened it, she found two tiny photographs, one of Caleb, one of herself, taken years ago. So you always have me close, he said softly, and so you can see yourself the way I see you. Lydia looked at the photograph of herself, at the woman captured there. She saw the lines around her eyes, the softness of her face, the plain features she'd spent so much of her life deprecating. But she also saw something else, the strength in her gaze, the quiet confidence in her bearing, the evidence of a life fully lived. I'm starting to see it, she said, tears in her eyes. Finally! I look at this picture and I see someone worth loving. About time, Caleb said gruffly, his own eyes bright. She stood and went to him, kissing him soundly in the middle of the restaurant, not caring who saw. He was her husband, her partner, the man who'd spent 25 years teaching her to see her own worth. I love you, she said against his lips. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. Good, he said. That's exactly how it should be. That night, lying in his arms in their hotel room, such a luxury, Lydia thought about the girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach 25 years ago, terrified and certain of her own inadequacy. That girl felt like a stranger now. She'd become someone else through the years, someone stronger, braver, more certain of her place in the world. And it had all started with a man who'd looked at her and seen beauty where she'd seen only plainness, who'd chosen her deliberately and completely, who'd never stopped reminding her of her worth until she finally truly believed it. What are you thinking? Caleb murmured sleepily. That I'm grateful, she said, for all of it, every hard year, every struggle, because it brought me here, to this moment, to you. He pulled her closer. We're not done yet. We've got years ahead of us still. I hope so, she whispered. I hope we have forever. But even as she said it, Lydia felt the weight of time pressing down. They weren't young anymore. The years stretched behind them now, longer than the years ahead. She pushed the thought away and focused on the present, the warmth of her husband's body, the steady beat of his heart, the miracle of 25 years together. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Tonight, she had everything she needed. The years that followed their anniversary settled into a bittersweet cadence. Lydia turned 50 that winter, a milestone that arrived with aching joints and gray hair she no longer bothered to hide. Caleb was 54, his body marked by decades of punishing ranch work, a limp from a horse that had kicked him years ago, hands gnarled by arthritis, shoulders that protested every morning until he moved enough to loosen them. But they were still here, still working, still together. Grace visited one spring afternoon with her 3 children in tow. Little Lydia was 7 now, with her grandmother's round face and her grandfather's striking eyes. The boys, William and James Jr., were 5 and 3, wild as March wind and twice as unpredictable. They're exhausting, Grace said, collapsing into a chair while the children raced around the yard with Caleb trailing after them at a more measured pace. I don't remember having this much energy when I was young. You did, Lydia assured her, pouring coffee. You just don't remember because you were too busy using it all. Grace laughed, then studied her mother with concerned eyes. You look tired, Mama. Are you getting enough rest? I'm fine. Just getting older, like everyone does. You're working too hard. The ranch is too much for just you and Pa now. Lydia wanted to argue, but the truth sat heavy between them. The ranch was too much. Every year it got harder to keep up with the endless demands. They talked about hiring more help, but good hands were expensive and money was always tight. We're managing, Lydia said instead. Mama. Grace reached across the table and took her mother's hand. I've been talking with James. We want to move here. Help run the ranch. It should have been ours years ago anyway. Lydia's throat tightened. What about your place? We could rent it out or sell it. James's brother has been wanting to buy it. Grace squeezed her hand. You and Pa have given everything to this land. Let us help carry it now. The offer was generous, practical, and it meant having Grace close again, having grandchildren nearby. But it also meant admitting they couldn't do it alone anymore. That age had finally caught up with their stubborn determination. Let me talk to your father, Lydia said quietly. That night, she broached the subject with Caleb while they prepared for bed. He listened in silence, his face unreadable in the lamplight. "What do you think?" she finally asked. "I think she's right. I think we're too old to keep doing this alone." He sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "I think I hate admitting that." Lydia sat beside him, taking his weathered hand in hers. "We built something good here, something worth passing on. Maybe it's time to let the next generation carry it forward. I'm not ready to stop working. Neither am I. But we could work less, share the burden, maybe even rest sometimes." He turned to look at her, and she saw the fear in his eyes. Fear of becoming useless, of losing purpose, of fading into irrelevance. "You'll always be needed," she said softly. "The ranch won't run without your knowledge and experience. Grace and James will need us. The grandchildren will need us. Just in a different way than before." "When did you get so wise about letting go?" "I've had practice," she said, thinking of their children leaving one by one. "And I've learned that letting go doesn't mean losing. It just means the shape of things changes." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Tell Grace yes." The move happened that summer. Grace and James and the children arrived with a wagon full of belongings, and suddenly the house was full of noise and laughter again. They added another room to accommodate everyone, turning the ranch into a true family compound. The transition wasn't always smooth. Caleb and James had different ideas about how to run certain operations, leading to tense discussions that Grace and Lydia had to mediate. The children were underfoot constantly, turning the once orderly house into cheerful chaos. Privacy became a luxury. But there was joy too. Waking to the sound of grandchildren's laughter, watching Caleb teach young William how to rope a fence post, seeing Grace manage the household accounts with the same careful attention Lydia had used for decades. One evening, Lydia found little Lydia sitting on the porch steps, her small face troubled. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Sally Henderson said I'm too fat to be pretty," the girl said quietly. "She said boys won't like me when I get older." Lydia's heart clenched. She sat down beside her granddaughter, who had indeed inherited her sturdy build along with her name. "Do you know what your grandfather told me the first day we met?" Lydia asked. Little Lydia shook her head. "He told me I was beautiful. And I didn't believe him because I'd spent my whole life thinking I was plain and unremarkable, just like Sally is trying to make you feel right now." "But you are beautiful, Grandma." "Thank you, sweet girl. But I didn't always think so. It took your grandfather 25 years of telling me before I finally believed it. 25 years I wasted doubting myself." Lydia put her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. "Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't let anyone else tell you your worth. You're strong and smart and kind, and those things matter more than what Sally Henderson thinks about how you look." "Mama says the same thing, because it's true. Your mother learned it from watching your grandfather love me. She learned that real beauty has nothing to do with what you see in a mirror." Little Lydia leaned against Lydia's side. "I'm glad I'm named after you, Grandma." "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." The seasons turned. Thomas came home for Christmas with news that he'd met someone, a fellow teacher named Margaret who shared his love of books and learning. Sarah wrote that she was engaged to a missionary she'd been working with, a man named Daniel who wanted to build a school in Oregon. The family gathered that Christmas was different from any before. 3 generations under one roof, the table crowded with bodies and noise and laughter. Lydia watched it all with tears in her eyes, her children grown and building their own lives, her grandchildren healthy and loved. Caleb at the head of the table looking tired but content. This was what they'd built. Not just the ranch or the house, but this. Family, legacy, love that rippled outward. After dinner, while the children played and the adults talked, Caleb pulled Lydia outside onto the porch. The night was cold and clear, stars brilliant overhead. "Look at all of this," he said, gesturing toward the house where warm light spilled from every window. "Did you ever imagine it would be this much?" "No," Lydia admitted. "When I stepped off that stagecoach 30 years ago, I was just hoping not to be a disappointment. I never dreamed of this." "You could never be a disappointment." He pulled her close, and she tucked herself against his side the way she'd done 1,000 times before. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Lydia Turner." "Even when I couldn't dance?"
especially then. He pressed a kiss to her hair. I love you. Have I told you that today? Only 4 times. You're slipping. Then let me make it 5. I love you, Lydia. I love you for being brave enough to come here. I love you for building this life with me. I love you for being the best mother our children could have had. I love you for every day of the last 30 years. Lydia tilted her head back to look at him. His face was lined now, weathered by wind and sun and time. His hair was more gray than dark.
But his eyes were the same, that storm cloud blue that had seen her truly from the very beginning. I love you too, she whispered, more than I have words for. They stood together in the cold, holding each other while their family's warmth spilled out around them, and Lydia thought that this exact moment, was worth every hard year, every struggle, every moment of doubt. But time was relentless, and the next years brought changes that couldn't be stopped or slowed. Martha Davis passed away in her sleep one winter night, simply didn't wake up from dreams of the husband she'd lost years before. At the funeral, Lydia stood beside the grave and thought about friendship, about the wisdom Martha had shared, about all the ways their lives had intertwined. She was a good woman, Caleb said quietly. She was, Lydia agreed. She taught me important things, about love, about worth, about holding on. The losses continued. Reverend Michaels, who'd married both generations of their family, died the following spring. Several of the old ranching families moved away or sold out to younger buyers. The frontier that had shaped their lives was changing, becoming something tamer and more settled. Caleb's health began to fail in small, insidious ways. His limp grew more pronounced. His hands shook sometimes, making fine work impossible. He tired more easily, needing to rest in the middle of tasks that once wouldn't have winded him. Lydia watched these changes with growing fear, but she kept her voice steady and her hands sure. She helped him when he needed it, gave him space when he didn't, and never once suggested he was anything less than the strong man she'd always known. One morning, she found him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. I can't button my shirt, he said quietly. My fingers won't cooperate. Lydia knelt before him and carefully buttoned each button, her own hands steady despite the way her heart was breaking. There, she said when she finished, handsome as ever. I'm falling apart, Lydia. You're getting older. We both are. That's not the same as falling apart. She cupped his face in her hands. You're still you, Caleb. Still the man who saw me clearly 30 years ago. Still the man who built this ranch with his own hands. Still the man I love more than anything. I don't want you to have to take care of me. Why not? You've been taking care of me for 3 decades. It's my turn now. That's different. How? She challenged, using his own words from years ago. We're partners, remember? We take care of each other. That's what we've always done. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. She held him while he trembled, this strong man who'd carried so much for so long finally allowing himself to be vulnerable. I'm scared, he whispered. I'm scared of leaving you. Then don't, she said fiercely. Stay with me. Fight. We're not done yet, Caleb Turner. He did fight. Through that summer and into fall, he pushed himself to keep working, to stay useful. But Lydia could see the toll it took, could see him diminishing day by day despite his best efforts. Grace noticed too. She and Lydia had a quiet conversation one afternoon while Caleb napped. How bad is it? Grace asked. Bad enough that I'm frightened every time he goes out to check the herd. Bad enough that I wake up sometimes just to make sure he's still breathing. Lydia's voice broke. I don't know how to do this. How to watch him fade. Grace took her mother's hands. You do what you've always done. You love him. You're there. You make sure he knows how much he matters. It's not enough. It's everything, Mama. It's all any of us can do. That winter was mild, a blessing they were all grateful for. Caleb grew weaker but remained lucid and present. He spent hours with his grandchildren, telling them stories about the early days of the ranch, teaching them lessons he wanted them to remember. One afternoon, Lydia found him with little Lydia in his lap, the child's small hand clasped in his gnarled one. Grandpa, tell me again about when you and Grandma got married, the girl said. Well, Caleb began, his voice rougher than it used to be, but still warm. Your grandmother stepped off a stagecoach looking terrified and beautiful, though she didn't believe the beautiful part yet. Why not? Because sometimes people don't see themselves clearly. They believe lies about who they are instead of seeing the truth. What's the truth about Grandma? That she's the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. That she built this ranch with me through hard work and harder times. That she gave me everything good in my life. Your mother, your uncles, you, and your brothers. Little Lydia looked over at Lydia standing in the doorway. Is Grandpa right, Grandma? Are you beautiful? Lydia met Caleb's eyes across the room, saw the love and certainty there that had never wavered in 32 years. Your grandfather is always right, she said softly. That night, after the house had quieted and everyone else slept, Caleb asked Lydia to come outside with him. She wrapped them both in blankets, and they sat on the porch in the cold darkness, looking out at the land they'd built together. I want you to promise me something, he said quietly. Anything. When I'm gone, and I will be, probably sooner than later, I want you to keep living, really living, not just existing. Caleb, promise me, Lydia. Promise me you won't forget how extraordinary you are. Promise me you'll remember that you're beautiful and strong and worthy of every good thing. His hand found hers in the darkness. Promise me you won't go back to being that scared girl who stepped off the stagecoach thinking she was nothing special. Tears streamed down Lydia's face. I can't promise that. Not if you're not here to remind me. You won't need me to remind you anymore. You know it now. You believe it. I've seen it in you for years. You finally see yourself the way I've always seen you. You made me see it. No. His grip tightened on her hand. I just kept pointing it out until you were ready to look. The beauty was always there, Lydia. The strength, the grace, all of it. I just helped you find it. She leaned against him, feeling how frail he'd become, how the powerful body she'd known for 3 decades had been whittled down by time and illness. I don't know how to exist without you, she whispered. You'll manage. You're the strongest person I know. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. You'll grieve, and that's right. But then you'll live. You'll watch our grandchildren grow. You'll help Grace and James with the ranch. You'll keep being the center that holds this family together. I need you to stay. I know, love, I know. But if I can't, when I can't, I need to know you'll be all right. Lydia couldn't answer, couldn't promise what he was asking because the thought of life without him was unbearable. They sat together until the cold drove them inside, holding each other against the inevitable. Spring came late that year, snow lingering into April. Caleb's condition worsened with the thaw. He spent most days in bed now, his breathing labored, his body failing him piece by piece. But his mind remained sharp, and his love remained constant. He'd call Lydia to his bedside multiple times a day just to look at her, to tell her she was beautiful, to remind her of moments from their life together. Remember when Grace was born? He'd say. You were so strong, Lydia, so brave. Ooh, remember our first winter, when we thought we'd freeze to death, but we kept each other warm? Remember the barn dance when I stepped on your feet at least a dozen times and you laughed instead of complaining? She'd sit beside him and hold his hand and remember. All of it, every moment of their life together. The children came when they could. Thomas brought Margaret, his new wife, to meet his father. Sarah and Daniel made the long journey from Oregon. Grace was there constantly, managing the house and the ranch, while Lydia focused on Caleb. One evening in late May, when the cottonwoods were leafing out and the creek was running high with snowmelt, Caleb asked everyone to gather in the bedroom. The whole family crowded in, Grace and James and their children, Thomas and Margaret, Sarah and Daniel. I wanted to tell you all something, Caleb said, his voice weak but determined. I wanted you to know that watching you all grow into the people you've become has been my greatest joy. You're good people, strong people, the kind of people who make the world better. Pa, don't, Grace said, tears streaming down her face. Let me finish. He looked at each of them in turn. You take care of each other, you hear me? And you take care of your mother. She's going to try to take care of everyone else and forget about herself. Don't let her. We won't, Thomas promised. Caleb's eyes found Lydia last. And you, my beautiful Lydia, you promise me you'll remember. I promise, she whispered,
though the words felt torn from her chest. He died 3 days later in the early morning when the light was soft and new. Lydia was beside him, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall with increasing difficulty. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much, Caleb. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for every day of the last 32 years. His eyes opened one last time, focusing on her face. "Beautiful," he breathed. "So beautiful." And then he was gone. The grief was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on Lydia's chest until she couldn't breathe. She sat beside his body for hours, holding his hand, unwilling to let go. Grace finally had to lead her away, had to help her wash and dress while James and the other men prepared Caleb's body for burial. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, where he could see everything he'd built. The whole community turned out, and person after person spoke about Caleb's integrity, his kindness, his quiet strength. But it was little Lydia who said what her grandmother couldn't. "My grandpa always said my grandma was beautiful," the child said, her voice clear in the spring air. "He said it every single day, and he said that real beauty was about being strong and kind and brave. Grandpa was beautiful too, the most beautiful person I ever knew." Lydia stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, staring at the fresh-turned earth that covered the man she'd loved for more than half her life. "You were right," she whispered. "You were right about everything. I am strong. I am worthy. And you made me believe it." Tears streamed down her face. "But I don't know how to do this without you, Caleb. I don't know how to be whole when half of me is gone." The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed. Life continued, indifferent to her loss. But she could hear his voice in her memory, clear and certain. "You're the strongest person I know. You'll manage." So she would try. For him, for their children and grandchildren, for the life they'd built together. She would try to keep living even though her heart was broken. She would try to remember that she was beautiful, even without him there to tell her. She would try to honor everything he'd given her by being the woman he'd always believed she was. It was all she could do. It would have to be enough. The days after the funeral blurred together into a gray haze of grief and obligation. Lydia moved through the motions of living, rising, dressing, eating when Grace insisted. But nothing felt real. The house was full of people trying to help, trying to comfort, but all she wanted was silence and solitude and the impossible return of the man who'd been her entire world. At night, she lay on her side of the bed, the other half achingly empty. She'd reach out in the darkness, expecting to find him there, and the absence was a fresh wound every time. Some nights she pulled his pillow close and breathed in the fading scent of him, and some nights she wept until exhaustion finally dragged her under. Grace tried to coax her into helping with the ranch work, but Lydia couldn't bear it. Every fence post, every corral rail, every inch of the barn reminded her of Caleb's hands building it. The land they'd worked together for 3 decades felt like a monument to loss. 2 weeks after the funeral, she stood at the kitchen window watching James and the hired hands move cattle to summer pasture. It was work Caleb should have been doing, work he'd loved. The unfairness of it settled over her like a shroud. "Mama," Grace appeared beside her, drying her hands on her apron. "You need to eat something." "I'm not hungry." "You haven't eaten in 2 days." "Grace, please, I just need—" Lydia's voice broke. "I just need him back." Grace wrapped her arms around her mother, and Lydia finally let herself collapse. She sobbed against her daughter's shoulder, releasing some of the grief she'd been holding so tightly. Grace held her and wept too, mourning her father, supporting her mother, being strong when strength was needed. When the storm finally passed, Lydia pulled back and wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize for grieving, Mama. Pa would hate that. He'd hate seeing me like this, so weak." "You're not weak. You're heartbroken. There's a difference." Grace guided her to a chair. "But Pa also made you promise to keep living, to remember who you are." "I don't know who I am without him." "Yes, you do." Grace knelt beside the chair, taking Lydia's hands. "You're the woman who crossed half a country alone, who built a ranch from nothing, who raised 3 children and helped half the families in this territory, who taught me that I was worth loving exactly as I am." She squeezed Lydia's hands. "You're all of that, Mama. You always were. Pa just helped you see it." Lydia looked at her daughter's face, so earnest, so full of love and worry, and felt something shift in her chest. Grace was right. Caleb had spent 32 years teaching her to see her own worth, to understand that she was more than the plain girl who'd stepped off that stagecoach. If she let grief erase all of that, she'd be dishonoring everything he'd given her. "I'll try," she whispered. "I'll try to keep living. That's all anyone can ask."
The trying was harder than Lydia expected. Every morning she had to choose to get up, to face the day, to find reasons to keep going. Some days the reasons were small: feeding the chickens, mending a torn shirt, answering a letter from Thomas. Other days the reasons were larger: her grandchildren's laughter, Grace's need for help with the accounts, the ranch itself requiring her attention. Slowly, painfully, she began to emerge from the fog of acute grief. She started taking walks along the creek, the same path she and Caleb had walked countless times. She visited his grave and talked to him, telling him about the children and the ranch, and how much she missed him. She began to eat regularly again, to sleep without crying herself unconscious first. One evening, about 2 months after Caleb's death, little Lydia found her grandmother sitting on the porch at sunset. "Can I sit with you, Grandma?" "Of course, sweetheart." The child climbed into Lydia's lap, still small enough to fit comfortably. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn pink and gold. "I miss Grandpa," little Lydia said quietly. "I do too, every single day. Mama says he's in heaven now." "I hope so." "Do you think he can still see us?" Lydia considered the question. She wasn't sure what she believed about heaven or afterlife, but she knew what Caleb would want her to say. "I think if there's any way possible, he's watching over us, making sure we're all right." "What do you think he sees when he looks at you?" The question caught Lydia off guard. She looked down at her granddaughter's upturned face, so innocent and curious. "I think," Lydia said slowly, "he sees the same thing he always saw. Someone he loved. Someone he believed was beautiful." "You are beautiful, Grandma," just like Grandpa always said. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, sweetheart. Will you tell me a story about when you and Grandpa were young?" So Lydia did. She told her granddaughter about stepping off the stagecoach, terrified and certain she'd be a disappointment. About Caleb looking at her and seeing something she couldn't see in herself. About the simple wedding and the slow building of trust and love. About all the ways he'd shown her day after day that she was worthy of being chosen. Little Lydia listened with rapt attention, and when the story was finished, she said, "I want someone to love me like that someday." "You will, sweetheart, and you'll deserve it, because you're already learning to see your own worth. You won't waste years doubting yourself like I did." "That's because Grandpa taught you, and you and Mama are teaching me." Lydia hugged her granddaughter close, feeling something warm bloom in her chest. This was part of Caleb's legacy too, not just the ranch or the children, but the lessons he'd taught that were being passed down through generations. The understanding that worth came from character, that beauty was more than appearance, that love meant seeing someone clearly and choosing them anyway. As summer progressed, Lydia found herself gradually returning to life. She began helping Grace with the household management again. She tended her garden, putting in vegetables and flowers the way she had for decades. She spent time with her grandchildren, teaching little Lydia to sew and showing the boys how to identify birds and plants. The grief didn't disappear, she didn't expect it to, but it became something she could carry rather than something that crushed her. She learned to live with the empty space beside her, to find joy in memories rather than only pain and loss. Thomas and Margaret visited that fall, and Thomas pulled Lydia aside one evening. "You look better, Ma. Stronger." "I'm trying. Some days are harder than others. Pa would be proud of you, of how you're handling this." Lydia smiled sadly. "Your father spent 3 decades trying to teach me that I was strong. I suppose I owe it to him to prove he was right. He was always right about you." The winter was difficult, her first alone in more than 30 years. The nights were long and cold, and she missed Caleb's warmth beside her with a physical ache. But Grace and James and the children were nearby, and she was never truly alone. The house was full of life and noise, a reminder that the family she and Caleb had built continued even without him. On what would have been their 33rd anniversary, Lydia woke early and walked to Caleb's grave. Snow dusted the ground, and her breath misted in the cold air. She stood before the simple headstone and spoke aloud. 33 years ago today, I married you in that little church in Silver Creek. I was so scared, Caleb. I thought I was making the biggest mistake of my life, marrying a stranger who couldn't possibly want someone like me. She paused, gathering her thoughts. You proved me wrong about everything, about myself, about what I deserved, about what love could be. Tears froze on her cheeks. I miss you so much it feels like I can't breathe sometimes. But I'm still here, I'm still living, like I promised you I would. The wind whispered through the bare cottonwood branches, and Lydia felt, maybe imagined, a sense of peace settle over her. I know who I am now, she continued. I'm strong. I'm capable. I'm worthy of love. And I'm beautiful. Not because of how I look, but because of who I became beside you. She touched the cold stone. Thank you for seeing me, Caleb. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for every single day. She stayed until the cold drove her back to the house, where Grace had coffee waiting and grandchildren who wanted her attention. Life continued, demanding her participation even in grief. Spring arrived again, bringing renewal to the land. Lydia was 53 now, her hair completely gray, her body marked by decades of hard work. But there was strength in her still, and purpose. She threw herself into preparing the garden, into helping with spring calving, into all the rhythms of ranch life that had shaped her for so long. One afternoon, she found a box in the back of the closet, old letters tied with string, her letters to Caleb from before they were married, and his responses. She sat on the floor and read them all, remembering the woman who'd written with such careful honesty about her plainness, her ordinariness, her certainty that she'd never be enough. Caleb's responses were just as she remembered, kind, honest, full of respect for the woman he hadn't yet met but already valued. She came to his last letter before she'd traveled west, the one where he'd written, "Your honesty tells me more about your character than any flattery could. If you're willing to take a chance on a ranch in rough country and a man who's better with cattle than words, I'd be honored to have you." Honored to have her, not settling, not making do. Honored. Lydia pressed the letter to her chest and wept, but this time the tears were bittersweet rather than purely sorrowful. She'd been so blessed, so incredibly blessed to have found a man who saw her truly and loved what he saw. Not every woman got that. Not every woman got 32 years of being cherished and valued and reminded daily of her worth. She carefully returned the letters to their box and placed it in her dresser drawer. These were treasures now, evidence of a love that had transformed her life. The years continued to pass. Lydia settled into her role as matriarch of the family, the center around which everyone orbited. She watched her grandchildren grow, little Lydia becoming a thoughtful young woman, the boys growing tall and strong. More grandchildren arrived as Thomas and Margaret had children, as Sarah and Daniel's family expanded in Oregon. She became the keeper of stories, the one who remembered the early days and could tell the children about their grandfather. She described Caleb's integrity, his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in the worth of every person. She'd tell them about the ranch when it was just a cabin and a dream, about the hard winters and harder work, about community and commitment. And always, she'd tell them about love, about being seen, about choosing and being chosen. Grace's children were particularly fascinated by their grandparents' story. Little Lydia, now 15 and growing into a beautiful young woman, asked her grandmother one evening, "How did you know Grandpa was the right one, when you'd never even met him?" Lydia considered the question carefully. "I didn't know. Not at first. It was a leap of faith. But your grandfather made it easy to trust him. He was exactly who he said he was in his letters, honest, kind, true to his word." "But when did you know you loved him?" "I think I started loving him the moment he told me I was beautiful and meant it. Not because he should have felt that way, but because he genuinely saw me that way." Lydia smiled at the memory. "But the love grew over time, through shared work and shared struggle, through him showing up every single day and choosing me again. That's what I want someday," little Lydia said softly. "Someone who sees me the way Grandpa saw you." "You'll find it, sweetheart, or it will find you, and when it does, You'll recognize it because you already know your worth. You won't waste years doubting yourself like I did." The girl hugged her grandmother tightly. "I love you, Grandma. I love you too, sweet girl." Time moved differently now for Lydia. Days blurred together in comfortable routine. She was 61, then 65, then 70. Her body grew frail, her hands gnarled with arthritis, her steps slower and more careful. But her mind remained sharp, and her heart remained full. She still missed Caleb with an ache that never fully disappeared, but the grief had transformed into something gentler. Not forgetting, but remembering with gratitude rather than only loss. She could think of him now and smile, could remember moments that brought joy rather than pain. Grace worried about her constantly, trying to get her to rest more, to let others do the heavy work. But Lydia was stubborn. She'd lived her whole adult life being useful, and she wasn't ready to stop just because she was old. One spring morning, when Lydia was 74, she woke feeling strange. Not ill exactly, but different, tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. She rose slowly and dressed, then walked outside to watch the sunrise the way she'd done thousands of times before. The world was beautiful in the early light. The cottonwoods were leafing out in brilliant green. The creek ran high with snowmelt. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The ranch, her ranch, Caleb's ranch, their children's ranch, thrived. She made her way slowly to Caleb's grave, something she still did regularly even after all these years. "Good morning, my love," she said, settling onto the bench James had built beside the headstone. "It's a beautiful day, the kind you always loved." She sat in companionable silence, as she often did, just being near him. "I've been thinking about that first day," she continued. "When I stepped off the stagecoach, absolutely terrified. I was so certain I'd be a disappointment, that you'd take one look at me and regret everything." A meadowlark sang somewhere nearby, its song bright and clear.
Instead, you looked at me and saw everything I couldn't see in myself. And you never stopped looking at me that way.
Not for 32 years. Not for a single day. Lydia touched the headstone, running her fingers over his name. "You gave me everything, Caleb. A home, a family, a life I never dreamed possible. But most of all, you gave me myself. You taught me to see my own worth." She was quiet for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. "I'm tired," she admitted softly. "So tired. And I miss you. I've missed you every day for 22 years. But I kept my promise. I lived. I really lived. I watched our grandchildren grow. I helped Grace and James build something even bigger than what we started. I remembered who I was, who you taught me to be." The weariness settled deeper into her bones, but it wasn't frightening. It felt almost like peace. "I think I'm ready now," she whispered. "Ready to rest. Ready to see you again, if that's possible." She smiled. "I hope it is. I hope you're waiting somewhere, ready to tell me I'm beautiful one more time." Lydia sat on the bench as the sun climbed higher, warming the spring air. She thought about her life, all 74 years of it, the struggles and triumphs, the children she'd raised and the grandchildren who carried pieces of her and Caleb forward into the future. The ranch that had been built with calloused hands and stubborn determination. But mostly, she thought about love, about a man who'd seen past every lie she'd told herself, who'd chosen her deliberately and completely, who'd spent 3 decades teaching her that worth wasn't about appearance or perfection, but about character and courage, and the decision to keep showing up. She'd been so blessed, so incredibly, impossibly blessed. Grace found her hours later sitting peacefully on the bench with her hand resting on Caleb's headstone. At first she thought her mother was simply resting, but when she drew closer, she understood. Lydia had gone to join her husband. The funeral was held on a perfect spring day, with the whole community gathered to mourn and celebrate. Grace stood before the assembly with tears streaming down her face and spoke about her mother. "My mother believed for most of her life that she was ordinary," Grace said. "She came west thinking she'd be lucky if anyone wanted her. But my father saw what she couldn't see, that she was extraordinary, that she was beautiful in all the ways that mattered." She paused, gathering herself. He spent 32 years teaching her that truth, and she spent the last 22 years of her life proving she'd learned it. She was strong. She was capable. She held this family together through loss and hardship. She taught us all, her children, her grandchildren, that our worth doesn't come from how we look or what others think of us, but from who we are and how we love. Little Lydia, now a woman of 35 with children of her own, stood to speak next. "My grandmother gave me her name," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "But she gave me something more important too. She taught me to see myself clearly, to know my worth, to believe I deserve to be loved exactly as I am." She looked at the simple casket. She learned that lesson from my grandfather, and she made sure we all learned it too. That's her legacy. Not just this ranch or this family, but the understanding that being truly seen by someone who loves you is the greatest gift there is. They buried Lydia beside Caleb on the hill overlooking the ranch. The two headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of two people who'd built something beautiful from nothing but hope and hard work, and the decision to see the best in each other. Years later, when this ranch had passed to the next generation and the next, when the original cabin had been replaced and expanded and modernized, when the frontier had become settled and tame, the story of Lydia and Caleb still lived on. It was told to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The story of a woman who thought she was ordinary and a man who showed her she was extraordinary. Of love that began with being truly seen and grew through decades of choosing each other. Of a partnership that transformed not just two lives, but generations. The ranch they'd built with their own hands still thrived, worked by descendants who carried pieces of both of them forward. And on the hill where they rested together, wildflowers bloomed every spring, as if the land itself remembered the love that had shaped it. Because that's what their story was really about. Not romance or grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the quiet revolutionary act of seeing another person clearly, flaws and all, and choosing to love them anyway. Of helping someone see their own worth when they'd spent years believing they had none. Of building a life together one day at a time through struggle and joy, loss and triumph. Lydia had come west believing she was plain and forgettable. She'd found a man who saw her as beautiful and unforgettable. And in learning to see herself through his eyes, she discovered a truth that echoed through generations. That being seen, truly, completely, honestly seen, was its own kind of miracle. That love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing someone deliberately and showing up every day to prove it. That worth wasn't something you earned or achieved, but something inherent that the right person could help you recognize. And that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with someone simply looking at you and seeing what you couldn't see in yourself, and never, ever stopping.